No one waits for a 16-year-old girl to give birth in silence, but she did, with no ring, no roof, no name to call for help. Welcome back, friends. This is Dieu Han's journey, a life that began with loss and keeps walking anyway. If this story stops you for even a second, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's not let this kind of courage disappear just because it's quiet. The morning light crept in slow, soft through the trees. Dieu Han stood by the wall, her hands lightly folded, her mind far away. A breeze passed, and with it came the ache of home, not the place, but the feeling. It hadn't even been a full month since she left the village, yet it already felt like another life. She missed it sometimes. Other times, it scared her. Not the roads but the people. And now, her fear was for Yan. No one had ever promised to protect her before. Not like that. Not with such calm certainty. All her life, she had been her own shield, her own escape plan. Dieu Han didn't know what it meant to lean on someone. But here Yan was, offering something more than shelter. Offering a line between fear and peace. And for a second, Dieu Han allowed herself to believe it might be real. Just for a second. I used to dream of running, Dieu Han whispered. Now I just dream of staying. Yan didn't answer right away. She simply took Dieu Han's hand in both of hers and held it, no words. Just warmth. The kind that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't need explanation. Dieu Han blinked fast. She hated crying, especially for kindness. But sometimes, it's not the pain that breaks you. It's being treated like you matter. Dieu Han looked at Yan, really looked. Not at her face, but at what was behind it. The steadiness. The refusal to fear. No one had ever stood that still for her before. Her heart twisted, confused between comfort and disbelief. She wanted to ask why. Why help me? Why stay? But all that came out was a breath held too long. Yan didn't look away. She let the silence speak. And in that quiet, something inside Han softened. She didn't know when she had last felt safe just sitting beside someone. No pressure to talk. No demand to explain. Yan didn't ask her to open up. She simply stayed. And Dieu Han realized that staying, just staying, was one of the rarest gifts. In a world that had often left her behind, Yan's presence felt like a small rebellion against abandonment. Like a whisper saying, I'm not leaving. Not yet. Not until you're ready. Dieu Han's throat tightened. Not from pain, but from the unfamiliar warmth rising in her chest. It scared her, that feeling. She had built walls so high even hope couldn't find its way in. But Yan didn't knock. She waited. And somehow, that was harder to resist. Dieu Han didn't say thank you. She couldn't yet. But in her stillness, in the way her shoulder leaned ever so slightly toward Yan's, there was gratitude. Quiet, but real. For a brief moment, Dieu Han imagined what it would be like to stay. To stop running. To breathe without fear of what came next. Yan didn't offer promises of forever. But she gave her something more honest today. And sometimes, today was enough. Enough to rest. Enough to hope. Enough to believe, just a little, that tomorrow might not hurt as much as yesterday did. Dieu Han held onto that thought like a lifeline. Dieu Han looked over at Yan, eyes steady now. There was a quiet decision forming in her chest. She didn't want to leave without saying something. Not this time. Not when those two old people might still be wondering. I think I should go see them. Her voice was low but clear. Yan turned to her, no surprise in her face. Just calm acceptance, the kind that says I already knew you would. Do you want me to come with you? Yan asked gently, not pushing. Dieu Han nodded, a little too quickly. The truth was, she didn't want to face it alone. She wasn't afraid of people anymore. But she was still learning how to carry herself through these moments. Yan stood up without a word. Just a small nod, the kind that said I'm here. And sometimes, that meant more than anything else. Each step forward felt heavier than it looked. Dieu Han walked beside Yan, with Tom's tiny footsteps trailing behind. The path was quiet, but her mind wasn't. What would she say? What if she froze? She wasn't going to ask for anything. Just show her face. Just let herself be seen. It sounded simple, but her chest tightened with every thought. Yen didn't speak. She just matched her pace, like a friend who knew when to stay close without asking why. They walked side by side through the narrow path leading to the old couple's home. The air smelled of wet leaves and morning soil. Dieu Han's hands were cold again, but she didn't mind. Her heart beat steady, not fast. She wasn't going there to demand or to prove anything. Just to stand in front of them. Just to say she existed. And maybe that was enough to bring peace to at least one part of her story. Dieu Han kept walking, lost in the weight of what she might face. But beside her, Yen had started to slow down. Her steps grew shorter. Then she stopped. Dieu Han turned, worried. Yen placed a hand on her stomach, her face tightening. I don't feel well. Maybe something I ate. You go ahead, I'll go back. She said it lightly, but something in her tone felt off. Dieu Han nodded, but her heart felt suddenly alone. Dieu Han stepped quietly into the yard, her child holding tightly to her fingers. The gate creaked behind them, but no one came out. It felt strange being there again. She hadn't planned what to say. She only knew she had to stand there, not for answers, but for peace. Her son looked up at her. She squeezed his hand gently, as if telling both of them to stay brave. The silence felt almost sacred, like it had been waiting for her return. The dirt road blurred under her feet. Yen's eyes stayed forward, but her mind drifted back. She saw herself younger, frightened, gripping her clothes as voices shouted around her. They said she was lucky. They said girls like her didn't get choices. She had nodded, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. That day changed everything. That day broke something in her. She never told Dieu Han the whole story, not yet. Maybe not ever. She remembered the face. Not cruel, not soft. Just firm. Just final. The man who stood by the doorway, arms crossed, deciding her fate without a word from her. That was her mother's husband. The one she never called father. She never even called him uncle. Just Mr. Chin. A name she had pushed out of her mouth all her life. But now, that name had returned. And it belonged to the man Dieu Han had just met. Yen stopped walking. Her breath came sharp, sudden. The pieces were all falling into place, and they made her sick. She had sent Dieu Han there, thinking it was just an old neighbor. Just a man. But it was him. She had handed her friend to the very person who once erased her voice. Yen's hands clenched. 4 years she had survived by forgetting. But the past never forgets. Especially when it's standing in front of someone else's door. Outside the gate, Yen leaned against a tree, her hands trembling. She had come this far with Dieu Han, believing she was helping. Now, she wasn't sure. Her past had caught up to her in the most twisted way. She had never told anyone what happened that night. How fast it all moved. How her opinion didn't matter. Yen felt the shame crawl back under her skin, familiar and heavy. It always knew where to find her. She had survived by staying silent. That was what they taught her. Be quiet, obey, move on. So she buried it all. Her voice. Her angered her name. But watching Dieu Han walk into that yard had shaken something loose. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about closure. It was about truth. Yen closed her eyes. The truth always outlives denial. And now, it stood between her and the friend she promised to protect. Yen's hands gripped the cloth tighter. That voice. She hadn't heard it in years. It wasn't cruel, but it carved into her memory like cold steel. The way he looked at girls like objects to be moved around, as if their futures were things he could arrange and discard. She had once been part of that system. Dieu Han didn't know. Yen had never spoken of it. But now, watching this unfold, it felt like a confession written in silence. She wanted to scream. To run in and say no. to stop this moment from becoming another scar. But she couldn't. Dieu Han needed this. Yen knew that. Some journeys can't be interrupted. Some truths have to land without warnings. Her heart ached watching her friend stand so steadied, so alone. She wasn't a child anymore. And neither was Yen. But pain, when remembered, always finds the child hiding inside. Yen stepped back. Her pulse roared in her ears. The weight of years pressed down on her shoulders. She wasn't sure if Dieu Han would be hurt or healed today. Maybe both. But Yen knew this much. Whatever happened next, they would no longer be the same, not her. Not Dieu Han. And maybe that was what scared her the most. That truth doesn't just reveal. It changes. Sometimes without permission. Dieu Han's voice came slowly, careful. Like each word had to ask permission before leaving her mouth. I don't want to bother you. I brought my address in case. She paused, eyes lowered. If my father ever comes back here, could you give it to him? Her hand shook as she offered a folded paper. She wasn't asking for hope. Just a bridge. Something to leave behind in case the past ever wanted to catch up. When Dieu Han mentioned returning to her hometown, the old man's face changed. His eyes sharpened, and his voice rose for the first time. Why now? After all this time, you show up and leave again. He stood, breath heavy, hands clenched. Dieu Han flinched. I only wanted to leave my address, she said softly. But the silence that followed wasn't kind. It burned. She wasn't expecting warmth, but she hadn't prepared for rejection either. She hadn't expected him to shout. But the moment she mentioned leaving, something in his face hardened. As if her absence was a wound he didn't want to reopen. Dieu Han stood still, not out of strength, but out of shock. I'm not running, she whispered. I just have nowhere else to go. Her words floated in the heat between them. The old man turned away for a second, like he didn't trust his voice to respond. Mrs. Chin didn't raise her voice. She just looked at her husband, firm and calm. Enough, Chin. She's a girl, not your enemy. He opened his mouth to reply, but she raised a hand. You know what you have. That paper. Give it to her. For once, do right by someone. The man went quiet. Then, without another word, he reached into his shirt pocket. Dieu Han watched from afar, not daring to breathe. Without a word, Ancient stood up and went inside. A long moment passed. When he returned, he held a small folded paper in his hand. He walked up to Dieu Han and handed it to her, eyes avoiding hers. She accepted it with both trembling hands. Her heart was loud in her ears. This wasn't just an address. It was a key to something locked her whole life. She whispered thank you, barely hearing her own voice. Dieu Han clutched the paper as if it might vanish. Her lips trembled. Thank you. Thank you so much, she said again and again, each word softer than the last. The weight of the moment pressed into her chest. She hadn't expected this. A part of her had given up already. But now, this scrap of hope felt like sunlight after weeks of rain. Her throat tightened. She bowed low, not just from respect, but from something deeper, relief and ache. She didn't know how long she stood there. The paper in her hand seemed to hum with possibilities. A name, a street, a memory waiting to be found. Behind her, the air felt still, like time itself had stopped to let this moment pass. Dieu Han finally looked up, her eyes damp but steady. There was more ahead. More walking. More asking. But for now, she had something solid. A starting point. That alone felt like a miracle. She turned to leave, but paused. Looking once more at Eng Chin and Bia Chin, her voice was soft. I don't blame you. Maybe you didn't know. Maybe you did. But thank you for not throwing me away again. With that, she stepped back toward the road. Her steps were slow but certain. The past still hurt, but the future, it had shape now. Not just a dream, but a path, lit by a name written in faded ink. From behind a row of trees, Yen stepped out. She had been there the whole time, watching quietly, and seen. Her chest rose and fell as if she'd held her breath for too long. There were tears she hadn't let fall. Questions she didn't want answers to. But what she saw now was Dieu Han holding that paper closed. It hit something deep. A memory. A guilt. A wish that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to heal something broken. She didn't call out. Didn't rush to catch up. Yen simply stood there, arms folded, heart aching with the weight of too many unspoken things. She knew what that paper meant. Maybe she'd never say it aloud. But deep down, she hoped if Dieu Han ever found her father, he would hold her the way no one else ever had. Not with answers, but with arms strong enough to say, "I'm still here." As the gate closed behind Dieu Han, Chen turned to her husband. Her voice was low, weary. "You gave her the address." He nodded, avoiding her eyes. A pause hung between them. "You know they'll come asking soon, right?" His jaw clenched. "I know. But I couldn't turn her away. Even if the debt's breathing down my neck, I had to do one thing right. Just once." Her sigh was long, old. Trouble doesn't knock, it breaks in. Chen sat down slowly, her fingers shaking. "You owe too much. This isn't just money anymore. They'll come to collect lives, not bills." Chen didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, "I thought if I helped her stay, maybe her father would reward me. He's been searching. Maybe this was my chance to fix everything." Chen looked at him, eyes tired. "At what cost? And what if she's not a way out but a reminder?" Dieu Han had barely taken a few steps down the dirt path when she heard footsteps behind. She turned and there was Yen, out of breath, eyes wide. For a second, neither spoke. Then Yen blurted, "Wait, I wasn't sure you'd still be here." Dieu Han didn't answer right away. Her arms tightened around the child. But something in her eyes softened. Yen had come back. That alone after everything felt like a small mercy. Dieu Han smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from exhaustion and quiet triumph. Her arms still held her child close, but her heart felt just a little lighter. She looked at Yen and said softly, "Today was already more than I dared to ask for. I found something I never thought I would. Not just a paper, not just a name, but a reason to believe again. And sometimes, one good day is enough to carry you through the bad ones." Thank you for walking this quiet road with us today. If Dieu Han's story stirred even a small part of your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, sharing this video, or simply leaving a comment. Sometimes, one act of empathy, no matter how small, can change the way a story is remembered. And if you've ever felt lost, may you know this: you are not alone. Not to date, not ever.